Hey everybody, welcome back to the first interview of Season 4 of Toothpickings. I'm in the new Studio V. It has been reconfigured to fit your needs. I'm Brian. I have been reconfigured to fit the needs of this particular space. And today we're talking to Nancy Schumann. Nancy Schumann is an author of both fiction and nonfiction books, but of particular interest today is her nonfiction work. She has done a lot of work with female vampires and how they have been portrayed and interpreted over the centuries, starting from ancient folklore times all the way up until contemporary vampire fiction. So I can't wait to hear what she has to say and pick her brain about how vampires are portrayed. Are we going to spend enough time talking about Carmilla? Can you ever spend enough time talking about Carmilla? Find out. Nancy Schumann, thank you so much for being here on the Toothpickings webcast.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with a real big question right off the bat, and it's about the purpose of vampire fiction, and in particular, females in vampire fiction. It's not a news alert that vampire fiction tends to address some particular anxiety. That's something critics have been saying for generations. But I want to ask you, do female vampires address a different or a more specific anxiety than general vampire fiction?
Yes, they do indeed. If you look at folklore and legends, so before you get to the literature part, the female vampire is a lot older than the male vampire. And I'm using the word vampire a bit loosely here. I'm not going to get into the vampire is a literary figure and what you have in folklore isn't quite the same vampire. But let's call them vampire-like entities. In folklore, the female one is a lot older, has been around since the beginning of time, or at least the beginning of records for humanity. And that is quite natural. It will become apparent in a minute, because the fear, the anxiety that is addressed in the female vampire figures is all surrounding pregnancy and childbirth. And that's obviously something that humanity has had to deal with from its early conception. I mean, animals obviously have to deal with it, mammals at least. And they probably don't think about it in quite the same way as we do on a self-conscious level. But for humanity, that has been, from the beginning of time, a very real present thing that they've had to deal with in their daily lives. And there's an awful lot that can go wrong, even today in modern society with modern medicine and all the perks that we now have. There's still a lot that can go wrong around pregnancy and childbirth. So when you don't have those medical knowledge, those modern settings that we deal with now, that all seems very mysterious, and people had to address that, and they addressed it with the female vampire figures in various folklore, legends, etc. So these figures tended to be women who died in childbirth, which was obviously an occurrence that was far more common than it should be. And they returned from the dead and caused problems with other women's pregnancies, or potentially caused issues for the newborn babies. So it is quite a natural development to have that kind of figure and to have it as a female figure. And it's vampiric because obviously, I say obviously, I'm guessing that not everybody listening to this has actually experienced pregnancy and childbirth. So this might not be obvious at all. But newsflash, an awful lot of blood is involved in the process. That just comes with the territory. So therefore, having a female vampiric figure to explain that sort of mystery, such as dying in childbirth, babies dying, all the negative things that could happen, is quite a natural development.
Was it as simple as the legend would have it, the woman died in childbirth, now she's coming back to steal babies for herself so that she can mother the babies, or is it some sort of punishment she's trying to inflict on the living?
It tends to be an inflicting punishment, which again is natural when you think about it. The mystery that it explains is not just the individual death that happened. The return explains the problems that come from there. So whether the child has survived and died later on, whether other diseases appeared in other pregnant women, people lived in communities. So it would be very rare that there would only be one pregnant woman at any one time. So to basically explain a sort of contagion that wasn't really contagion, you had to have this recurring figure and this returning figure that dealt out punishment to other people.
There's about a dozen follow-up questions I could come up with based on what you've just said, but let me start with one that was a submitted question from Oma on Amino. He wanted to know who the oldest female vampire in folklore was. I have my suspicions what you're going to say. Let me see if I'm right. I'll pay myself $1.
I don't think there'll be any dollars that will be paid out here on this because there are an awful lot of folkloric figures in the for the female vampire figure, and the oldest ones tend to be going towards Asia, and there's quite a lot of them, and they come from languages that I'm not familiar with, so I'm really not good at pronouncing any of them. I'm going to point you towards China for the oldest female vampires in folklore that I could find, and I will not attempt to pronounce them.
I'm going to guess that you come down on the side of vampires are more global than those academics who say, no, vampires are only this thing particular to this one period of time in Eastern Europe. Is that right?
Well, the female vampire that I look at certainly strikes me as a more global figure, by which I don't mean that, there's a distinct starting point and it's spread from there. Mm-hmm. Pardon the pun. It's more that all of these communities experienced similar things and they tried to, or the explanations they came up with were very similar. And we end up with vampiric sort of entities. Like I said, the vampire, as most people think of it, is a literary figure. That's not exactly the same thing as what you find in those folklores going back centuries. That's not quite the same thing. And if you want to apply that sort of definition, then I can't disagree with the scholars that say it's an Eastern European thing from a very specific period of time. But the more vampiric entities that aren't strictly speaking vampires as such are a more global thing.
Well, I'm glad you used the word vampiric because it seems like a small difference, but I think the difference between vampiric and vampire is big.
Yeah.
In my reading of it, because lots of things can be vampiric. Without being specifically a vampire.
Exactly.
As long as we're talking about folklore, the superstars of folklore vampires in Europe are male, while the superstars of vampire folklore in America are female. Is there anything to be made of that, or is it too small of a sample size to really make any conclusions on?
That's a really, really good point that you're making there. And in some ways, I'm not really going to try to explain it. It's part of the explanation is a difference in taste, because the same thing that applies in folklore does apply in literature as well. So the earliest vampires in literature are also female, and they appear. We're not talking about a massive spectrum in time, so they don't appear massively before the superstar male ones appear, but they are definitely earlier. And they come from a British literature, British, German, Western European sort of context, and then kind of get superseded as soon as Dracula enters the stage and the vampire enters the stage by vampire, I mean the title of Polidori's story, not vampire as the figure, just now. And yeah, basically women in the Western European context never quite come back to the superstar status that they had prior to their being Dracula. Whereas America kind of obviously did Dracula. We all know it. Bram Stoker in his day did American tours, and Dracula was as popular as it was going to be in America. And there's definitely a Dracula scholarship. So it's not like they skipped it, but they kind of did in terms of just they didn't hover there. And the female vampire, gets back to the superstar status that it had before. And it is a very interesting fact, and that can be observed. I don't really have entirely an explanation as to why that might be. I'm quite sure there's something that can be made of it, but what it is, I'm just not sure. I mean,
and I'm sure there's samplings of male and female vampires on both continents. It just seems like for some reasons the ones that are best known in my country were female, and the ones that are best known in Eastern Europe were male. And I don't know why that was, but that seems to be the way it worked out somehow.
Yeah, it could be kind of as simple as that. But like you say, you do have examples for both on either side. So yeah, while the success and the superstardom should swing one way or the other is not entirely obvious.
But before we go too much further, you mentioned that the earliest vampires in literature were female. Are you talking about the Goethe poem, or is there something else that I'm not even aware of?
The Bride of Corinth is definitely one of them. There's Keats's Lamia can be regarded as a vampiric character. Okay. You have Coleridge's Christabel. Although obviously the titular Christabel is not the vampire character, it's Geraldine that's the vampire in that. So yeah, it's the poetry writing that introduces female vampires to literature, and with the prose, the male vampire comes in.
Why do you think that is, that the poets chose females for their vampires, but once novelists came into the picture, they migrated toward male vampires?
I'm not sure about the second part of that question in terms of explanation, but for the poetry, even though at the time, not just at the time, a longer form of poetry was the standard. You didn't just have your 20 lines in a poem, as most people's attention span seems to stretch to these days. You had far longer poems. So there's a narrative there, but still it's a much shorter form. It's a very restricted form in terms of rhyming patterns and rhythm and so on. So every word that you use has to count and pull its weight, basically. Whereas in prose, you can obviously explain much more, paint a picture in a completely different way. So when the female vampire enters poetry, she does so as a dangerous woman, as a seductress, basically as a killer. And that's already coded. So the audience of the time would have, when you mention Lamia, would have had an expectation before you've told the entire story of Keats's poem. They'd have a notion of what this is going to be about when it's called Lamia. So,
and for those that don't know, give me just a brief definition of what Lamia is.
So Lamia is Lamia comes from the Greek classics, and she is one of Zeus's mortal lovers. So again, a mortal woman at the start of the story. Now, in the classic story, Hera, Zeus's wife, not particularly happy about the affair, takes punishment out on Lamia and kills Lamia's children, forcing Lamia to watch. So obviously the Greeks had a fable for psychiatry at that point already, because that sort of thing doesn't make for a very balanced character. And Lamia comes back as a non-human entity who now haunts other human women, killing their children. So she becomes a vampiric character from that. And in literature, this sort of killer instinct, shall we say, is taken over and combined with beauty, which is not a stretch, because you have the affair at the start of the Greek story. So there must have been attraction there. And the combination of beauty and killer in a woman can only end bad as far as male literature is concerned, definitely. So that's your starting point for the female vampire in poetry at that point. And they're all kind of variations of the Lamia theme. So it is basically used as a shorthand to convey that image of a deadly, dangerous woman.
Let's talk about another dangerous vampire whose name begins with an L, and that's Lucy. Lucy Westenra from Dracula. Talk to me about what is interesting about her, how she doesn't actually go so far as to kill anybody, but yet it is assumed she's going to kill. What's going on there?
Oh, Lucy is absolutely, hands down, my favorite character in Dracula. I could spend hours talking about Lucy, not just because she's vastly less annoying than Mina. She is, there's so much going on. She's obviously Dracula's first victim upon his arrival in England. And, but she's not exactly helpless either. She's portrayed as being sort of complicit in the attack, and she's portrayed as being predestined. There's the whole her sleepwalking. There's clearly a history of mental health disease or mental health issues, I should say, in her family. All that sets her up from the onset to become a vampire victim. But again, she isn't just a victim. She is also a young woman with quite clear ideas as to where she wants to be in life before she encounters Dracula. A lot of scholarship addresses the detail where she talks to Mina about having been proposed to by 3 different men, and she's not at all happy about having to turn down 2 of them. And she says something along the lines of, why can't they let a girl marry 3 men? And there's a lot of scholarship on the subject of, Lucy is a terrible flirt, and she wants to be allowed to marry 3 men. Whereas my interpretation has always been, that's not really what's going on there. What's going on there is Lucy doesn't want to have to say no. Lucy doesn't want to break anybody's heart. She is willing to sacrifice her own ideas of happiness in her life to the wishes of these 3 men. And which I think is sets her up as a completely different character when you read it like that. And that, I think, plays into the whole, soon as she becomes a vampire and starts feeding on children, which, as we've talked about the last half hour or so, is the shorthand for the female vampire. We've come to expect that, or the readership will have come to expect that at that point. And she doesn't kill those children.
No, that's an important point. No one dies because of Lucy.
And she is, she seems to be, at that point, we never hear from Lucy again. We only ever see her through the eyes of the crew of light of the men who basically at that point are out to destroy her. So there isn't, it's all interpretation, obviously, but she seems to be quite happy. And she doesn't seem all that dangerous. And what is worse, I think, is basically Van Helsing could have prevented her becoming a vampire if that's such a bad thing from the start, because it's quite clear that he knows what's going on and he knows what to do about it. He gets the garlic and he gets the blood transfusions. He gets somebody to sit up with her, but none of these things are ever followed through, which is all these things happen that allow Dracula to attack again and for Lucy to become a vampire. And the only reason that would be the case, in my humble opinion, is because Van Helsing basically needs her to become a vampire. He needs to be able to show her off as a vampire who feeds on children, even if she never ends up killing the children. That's not important. The potential danger is what's important, because that's what he needs to show the young men so that they go basically with him to then kill Dracula and just accept everything upon his say-so. She's basically being used as the exhibition A for what Van Helsing ultimately wants to achieve.
Yeah, in all literature, you got to have your monsters have to start smaller before they get bigger. But it's not always the case that the heroes create the monsters for themselves to practice on before they go after the big bad.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, Van Helsing, well, as far as I'm concerned, Van Helsing is basically the real bad guy in the Dracula story, because he already has all the answers right at the beginning of the story where he enters the story, and he never feels the need to explain. And I think in the Lucy story, that's entirely deliberate because he already knows that he needs to show a real vampire for everybody else to believe him, despite the fact that he knows perfectly well what's going on from the start.
Now, there is a dark interpretation of Lucy's actions that she's molesting the children in addition to just feeding off of them. Do you take anything from that, or do you think that that's just an aberrant interpretation?
It's not an interpretation I'm willing to follow. I mean, I can kind of see where you'd come from, where you'd get the idea, because like I said, she does specifically go after children. But as I have, I think, hopefully explained, that is the natural place to start for the female vampire character. And that's what audiences definitely would have expected and been familiar with from a female vampire character. And Bram Stoker, obviously, I mean, his hero is Dracula. He has no intention of making any of his women in the story center stage. So again, it seems a far more likely thing that he's just gone with the approach of go with the short end that people are familiar with, because you're just using this character to show a particular development of the story. They are not a main character at that point anymore.
To that point, can we talk a little bit about how male authors and female authors treat the female vampire differently? Is there a how do you see Sheridan Le Fanu writing Carmilla differently than, say, Anne Rice would write Claudia?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Comparing these two in particular.
And it doesn't have to, we don't even have to necessarily compare Carmilla to Claudia, but when male writers write the female vampire, is there a distinct difference than how a female author would write a female vampire?
I'm going to start with the women because obviously I'm more familiar with that, which is precisely the point. If you are a woman writing a female character, your only stretch is the vampire bit. Mm-hmm. You are familiar with what it's like to be a woman. You are familiar with what it's like to be a female child. If you have a different setting in terms of time or place, then that would be something else to stretch, but you can probably research that or world build that. So you're basically focusing on building the vampire character as the new thing, while the rest of that character comes from things that are familiar to you. As a male author, obviously, I mean, we can assume that the male author will have come across women and girls in his life, but he's never been one, right, in all likelihood. Or shall we say in most cases? Let's say in most cases, because I don't want to sound like I'm excluding trans authors.
No, yeah, I understand what you're going for.
But so you have more that needs to be invented from a standpoint of something that's outside your own experience.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. That's a really good explanation. On that note, let's talk about the 45-year-old vampire who is eternally 5 years old, Claudia from Interview with a Vampire, a book that turns 45 this summer. How is Claudia different from other female vampires and other vampires in general?
Claudia is a very special character because there's an awful lot of layers to her otherness, being female, being a vampire, being a child, and being a very young child at that. I mean, she's, like you just said, only 5 years old in the books. For all that, everybody is probably now thinking of the wonderful performance that Kirsten Dunst gave in the movie, but she is twice as old as Claudia is supposed to be. Though probably very practical reasons. Who would want to get a 5-year-old try and act that role?
I can't imagine casting a 5-year-old to play Claudia in a real movie, but yes, and the book allows you to make those leaps that would be harder in cinema. Well, if you want to spin the casting question further, the 5-year-old who could convincingly play that would be a very scary 5-year-old. Believe me. Which is precisely the point of Claudia, I would say. She is just, because she is so young, she basically has no recollection of her human life at all. And while everything with her turning into a vampire starts fairly innocently, you know, by vampire standards, they're basically a surrogate family. They're raising a child because she's just become a vampire. She is still a child. But like every other child in the world, she grows up, but she grows up without her body physically growing older because she is also a vampire, which is exactly where the problems come in, because a grown-up woman, Claudia, is something that neither Louis nor Lestat can handle. And that's where the entire relationship breaks down. And it breaks down in a spectacular way. And Claudia is such an amazing vampire. I mean, she basically would outrun Louis, Lestat, and any other vampire, I think, pretty much apart from Gabriel, that Anne Rice has ever come up with. And she is your classical dangerous woman who is, because of her potential for danger, in the end not allowed to live. We have, when the relationship starts to break down, I mean, obviously, like I said, breaks down quite spectacularly with her wanting to kill Lestat and seemingly achieving to. I know we all know by now she doesn't, but certainly looks at first glance that she manages to kill him and start the life that she wants. And she initially thinks that life, she wants the life with Louis, and then comes to the end of the line with Louis as well. And we see very clearly that he also can't deal with a grown woman, Claudia. Mm-hmm. And the problem that Claudia obviously has is the extent of her otherness, because she never fits. She can't just blend in unless she pretends to be a child. And
a 5-year-old children, as we all know, real children sort of blink and you miss it. They grow up very fast. A 5-year-old child will change very quickly, growing older, and people will notice that. So Claudia couldn't stay in the same place for very long and pretend to be a human child. People would notice. She couldn't just go to school. I mean, I know it's set in a completely different time in terms of schooling, but let's just spin that as a thought experiment. People would notice, and would notice very quickly, that she doesn't change. And then, of course, there is the aspect of that wouldn't suit her at all, because in her mind, she's at that point, I believe, 65 she's supposed to be when she decides to kill Lestat. So she has a lifetime of human experience behind her. Why on earth would she want to hang out with other 5-year-olds at that point?
It's another interesting thing about Claudia is that her brain continues to age even though her body doesn't. And that seems to be a thing in a lot of vampire literature, that even though everything else about the body freezes in place, for some reason the brain continues to age and mature, never quite getting into the realm of dementia, which I think would be an interesting take on vampire fiction. But she doesn't stay eternally 5 in her brain development, which could have itself been a really interesting way to go, I think. Not second-guessing Anne Rice here, but that could have been an interesting way to write a child vampire, someone who never matures past 5 years old.
It would certainly make for an interesting story, but then you're basically addressing the other characters. How would the adult who's responsible for that child vampire then deal with them being a child forever and ever? I mean, we all know that parents tend to say they want their children to be children forever, but yeah, it would make an interesting story to actually write that being the case and see how they're like that. But yeah, obviously Anne Rice goes the other way, and which certainly makes for an interesting story as well. I won't rate which of these stories would be more interesting.
I wanted to address Madeline for a moment, because you talked earlier about female vampires and their relationship to motherhood. Louis creates Madeline, turns her into a vampire to be a sort of adopted mother for Claudia. And if my timelines are right, I think Claudia is actually older than Madeline.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic between those two characters?
Well, we're pretty much at the beginning of the story. We were just thought experimenting with the child not growing up, I guess, there. The bit of the story that we see is because their needs overlap. To blend in, Claudia needs to present as a child. Madeline has lost a child and wants to replace that. And at that point, their needs just intersect. And being a doll maker, Madeline puts all of her skills to use to basically change the world around Claudia and adjust it to fit Claudia. She basically changes from having endlessly creating the dolls that look like her daughter to changing the entire world around the child that doesn't change. From the outfits to making smaller furniture and just adjusting everything to suit Claudia, which it happens on a very small scale, but I guess similar to Lucy starting with feeding on children, just has the potential to change the entire world, because that's literally on the small scale what she starts doing, and change a world where Claudia is other to a world where only Claudia fits in. And unfortunately, we are never allowed to see that unfolding, because that would certainly be interesting. We're not giving, I think, the impression that Madeline is an entirely well-adjusted character. And that would further down the line quite definitely lead to another tension point that it would certainly have been interesting to see.
I agree. That would have been fun to see that story play out further.
I mean, I don't know. It could be potentially scary. I don't know whether the need, because Claudia needs Madeline, whether she's willing to admit that or not. Madeline just wants the Claudia child. And the motherly thing of giving that child all the opportunities and basically saying yes to her every whim. But how would that play out in another 60 years' time?
It's no secret that Anne Rice started writing that book after she lost a child. How do you think that the vampires help us deal with death, either death that has happened in our lives or our own impending doom?
Well, vampires give you a lot of narrative opportunity and being able to simultaneously address the death that happens while not actually dealing with it, because they're undead. They're then the person dies but isn't gone, which gives you multiple angles to deal with, the subject of death and the subject of loss, in terms of not immediately having to address that loss, which could be a good thing, but it could also be a very scary thing, and often is a very scary thing, because the dead are supposed to go away. They're not supposed to stay with us. So having to deal with the death, but then not experiencing the loss is also potentially problematic. And the vampire allows you to explore that, as well as the more natural death followed by loss scenario.
Let's jump back into this idea of motherhood. Because this was something you said in a talk that I heard you give at the Children of the Night conference. And I had never really thought about this, and I thought it was fascinating, this idea of vampire uber mothers. Can you tell me what that is?
The vampire uber mother kind of comes in to literature and other fiction in line with the third wave of feminism, where again we have a lot of female authors producing those stories and therefore writing out of their own experience, but also writing out of the expectations of the human world that obviously surround them. So nobody writes in a vacuum, obviously. And the real world, women, certainly in Western societies, but again, no judgment, have gained liberties, education, voting rights, and all manner of things over the past centuries that weren't originally part of the setup. So the vampire character in fiction does as well. And one of the things that I think mostly entered popular culture in the 80s was this idea of women being able to have it all. So have a family and have a career, which is picked up by the writers and projected onto the female vampire character. So you have a strong, monstrous vampire woman who can also be a mom and have a family or have some sort of other protective role in a community and society. That is basically the manifestation of women having it all.
Are we to understand that as the writers who create those uber mothers are accepting the idea of woman can have it all, or do we look at it as a warning? If you try to have it all, you are going to be a monster.
I'm going to say it depends on the story. There's an awful lot of stories where, and Everybody Hates Twilight is one of them, where Bella,
Not everybody. There's a lot of people who paid good money to buy that book and see that movie.
um, Bella is definitely an Übermother, and Bella is definitely a manifestation of sort of having it all. I mean, she goes to school, she graduates from high school, she has an education. Edward is always very keen on her going to college as well and experiencing that before she turns into a vampire, though that doesn't come to pass. And then obviously she gets to marry her first love and she gets to be a mom, which is, prior to that happening, very clearly articulated in the books as something the other vampire women feel they have missed out on. And being the reason that, I'm going to get the names wrong now, aren't I? It's Esme Cullen? Mother Cullen is basically has this adoptive coven of teenage vampires to play out her mother instincts because she can't have children. And Bella gets to have all of that. But while you can read that as her having it all and that being, a good thing, it does play out in a very conservative setting. It is the first love that she immediately marries. There is no other boyfriend ever on the horizon. There certainly is no other sexual partner for her ever. Their love is internal, and that's who she has the child with. And the child is perfect. It's a child that's never threatened by any disease or danger or anything. That just doesn't happen. So it does play out in a very fixed conservative setting. So it doesn't necessarily have to be read as a good thing. It can still be very limiting. She can only be as powerful as she is as an immortal vampire in that particular setting that is essentially a nuclear family with the extended family nearby.
Do you read Akasha and Sookie Stackhouse as both also being Ubermothers, or are they something different? Akasha from the Vampire Chronicles.
The Southern Vampires, yeah. So Sookie is definitely an Übermother. It just doesn't play out as a nuclear family because Sookie basically presents as a character who has the power due to her mind reading gift to deal with the vampires in a way that none of the other humans can, and be the linchpin of the link between the vampire society and the human society, and be the person ultimately responsible and powerful enough to protect her human society, but also protect the vampire society. So I'd certainly read her as an Übermother on that. It's just that it would be an example of where you can be an Übermother and have it all, and it's not in a conservative setting.
Does she ever become a vampire? I didn't get all the way to the end of that series. Does she become a vampire at some point?
I will have to admit that I never read the last book, so ultimately I don't know. At the point of time where I stopped reading, she isn't a vampire, but regularly ingests vampire blood and basically is described as being about as vampiric as it's possible to be without becoming a vampire.
Well, the good news is this is the internet, and someone is going to tell us what we got wrong.
Probably, yes. I mean, I did struggle at various points with the Sookie Stackhouse stories as well, but...
I wasn't going to bring up the Lost Boys, but what you were saying before made me recall that... I'm going to forget the name of the head vampire in the Lost Boys, the older man, wants to transform the mother into being a vampire so that his boys can have a mom. Is this a case of someone trying to create an Ubermother for a vampire world where none exists?
It's an interesting interpretation. It has the potential to be that. It is again very limiting to a small society in terms of basically creating a nuclear family, one that has a fair few teenage boys as kids, but still ultimately a nuclear family. And I think if I remember the movie correctly, I mean, I have seen it a few times, but not recently, the aim is for her to just be the mom. There is no indication that she's going to have any area of influence other than that. So she would be it
created.
sits on the fence. Yeah. It has the potential of making her into an uber mom, but it's not quite clear. It could just take her into a very limiting scope of existence as well.
Good point. So we could have had a very much a 1950s vampire household.
Yeah.
Yeah. And okay. That itself would have been an interesting way to go if she had become a vampire and then there was a clashing, because she is set up to be more headstrong and more independent right there at the beginning of the movie. You know, she is raising her sons by herself. She moves back in with her dad, but she has a career, she is a mom, and she has an independent streak, whether by her own nature or because that's the circumstances that she's in. But once that would come up against, Papa Vampire says, no, you stay home and you cook the blood soup while I go out and work, that could be an interesting conflict to explore.
So it was to me always part of the threat that would be, the future that they're looking at, it being limited to that vampire family life. Always part of the threat in my head as to why the vampires had to be destroyed.
Ragged Robin from Amina wanted me to ask you about Lady Dimitrescu from the Resident Evil, and we talked offline that you're not a gamer, I'm not much of a gamer. Basically, but from what I have read about her, I feel like I need to get more familiar because it sounds like she might fit your definition of Uber Mother, but I don't know for sure. I haven't played the game.
Well, I'm really not a gamer, and I would I have esteemed colleagues who know about that side of things, and I'd refer you to them. But I have certainly read up on it as well. And that in itself was quite interesting because it sounded like the development of the character was such that you started off with, the idea started off with a Lilith-like character that had a whole horde of demonic children, which was then downsized to having 3, which is a more traditional vampire Dracula 3 brides sort of setting. So there's some interesting stuff in development already going on with that character. But yeah, I'm afraid not a gamer, so we're well outside my area of expertise.
Well, games have become so much more plot and character driven than back when Miss Pac-Man was my jam. They're full-blown narratives now, and they're cultural touchstones in a way that they certainly weren't back when this Gen Xer was coming up. So I guess I got to play more games.
Well, either that or I stick to my method of waiting for them to be successful and somebody making a movie out of it, because the narratives are interesting, but I just can't really get myself into the games.
Well, let's play the lightning round here. I'm going to ask you a series of quick questions. Give me a quick answer here. You already told me your favorite female vampire. Tell me again.
My favorite female vampire is Claudia.
Claudia. Who's the female vampire you love to hate?
Ooh, I love to hate Akasha. We're staying with the Vampire Chronicles, I'm afraid, but
all right.
There's a lot of vampires there.
Is there a female vampire out there that is sort of like your Boba Fett? They were teased, there's a little bit of them, but you wish there was a whole lot more. You're fascinated. You want to know more about this character.
Gabriel, also Vampire Chronicles.
Who wins in a fight, the Brides of Dracula or the Bride of Frankenstein?
Oh, Dracula's Bride, definitely.
Who wins in a fight? Carmilla Karnstein or Claudia, name withheld?
Ooh, tricky one. I'm going to say Claudia.
All right. Will the United States see a female vampire president in our lifetime?
I hope so.
Can a vampire be a positive role model?
No good reason why they shouldn't be.
Can you give me one? Because I need a positive role model in my life.
I'm gonna go back to the Gabrielle character.
Okay, good. I was worried you were going to say Claudia. Or like, I think Claudia's right about at your maturity level, Brian, the 5-year-old. What is some brief but important words of advice you can give to some aspiring writers out there, whether they're fiction or nonfiction writers, but they want to get into this space? What advice would you give them?
Writer's block is not a thing. Don't let anybody tell you that it is.
That's brilliant.
It's either your body telling you that you need a break, in which case take a break, or it's your brain just being lazy. It's one of the two. I mean, you know, we all do it. We all do. I don't know. Do the dishes just as soon as I've done everything else. So that sort of thing happens. Don't let that happen, because telling yourself you can't write doesn't help. Of course you can write. You're a writer. That's what you do. You might not particularly want to at that point, but you can, most definitely. And like I said, occasionally it will just be your body telling you that you need a break. And then it's important to listen.
For those who want to read more about your books, give me that website where they can find your books.
That's www.bookswithbite.in.
That's important, the .in at the end, because I accidentally went to there's a different Books with Bite website out there somewhere.
Yes, the conventional URLs weren't available at the time, and we basically went the other way around. And when you can have IN which stands for international, in case anybody didn't know, and I was like, bookswithbite.in. I mean, that's literally a match made in heaven. So of course I'm having that URL. Thank you very much.
And what's the book that you've written that pertains to what we've talked about today?
The nonfiction book on vampires that you need from me, it's called Take a Bite, and that gives you a whistle-stop tour of female vampires from folklore to literature, basically covering the entire world.
And it's one of the few, I don't know if I've seen another book that focuses on female vampires from beginning to end the way that one does. If there's another one out there, I'm not aware of it.
Currently, touch wood, and I preemptively apologize if I've missed anything. I'm not aware of anything that currently focuses on the female vampire, like you said, which is kind of the point. I mean, the book came out of my master thesis, and when I was trying to come up with a subject, the vampires were very clear to start. And my other interest is gender studies. And there wasn't an awful lot out there on female vampires specifically. And I thought, well, I can make a valuable contribution, hopefully, but also it's going to be an awful long time to research. And this topic is going to keep me entertained while I'm writing it.
Right. Do you have anything else planned? Is there any other publications on the way?
Are we talking fiction or nonfiction?
Well, whatever you got in the hopper right now.
Not that really narrows us down, because there's I have a paper that I'm working on with the Gothic Studies magazine. And again, fingers crossed, they've just had a revision from me, and hopefully I don't get any requests for revisions back. It's actually a Canadian literature magazine, and which I'm quite pleased with. They're launching their first printed issue. Well, roundabout now. I haven't had a publication date yet, and I'll be in the first issue with a short story.
Excellent. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for being a part of this. This was fascinating for me as a straight white male to get this perspective on vampire literature and folklore. So thank you so much for being a part of it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Nancy Schumann, for making some time today, especially since there's such a big time difference between where I am and where she is. Doing this over Zoom is the only way anything like this is possible anymore. Way to go, pandemic. You gave us something good. You gave us Zoom. Anyway, take a look at her book, Take a Bite. It's the only book, as far as I know, that takes a survey of the entire field of folklore and fiction and concentrates only on female vampires and how they are portrayed. If there's another one out there, let me know. Maybe there's another interview on the horizon. But until then, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. I'll be seeing you again soon.